Proposed NASA budget cuts. This slide represents a lot of the kinds of things that NASA has done, including a lot of really groundbreaking things like the Voyager spacecraft up there on the upper right-hand side, the James Webb Space Telescope, the Mars landers, and so on. The cuts that are going through, that was started in the House of Representatives. They want to cut the NASA budget by 24%. That is going from about $25 billion down to $19 billion, which would result in the smallest budget requested since 1961 if you adjust for inflation. In particular, it's the big science programs that are really being cut a lot. It's 47%. That and Artemis. What they're saying is what I predicted some time ago, saying, yeah, they'll probably keep it up through Artemis 3. That is, Artemis 2 just sends some people around the moon and doesn't land. Artemis 3 lands some people there. They spend a little bit of time and come back. They're saying after that, get rid of the SLS rocket, the Gateway, the Orion space capsule, the whole thing. Figure we're going to do something else unspecified and not really funded. They're also going to cut back on the space station operations and the NASA education programs, public affairs, a lot of the education kind of programs. So it may be that we need NSS to take up more of that, which of course our next speaker will talk about. So how much is this money? $24.9 billion. It sounds like a lot of dollars, but it's only 0.28% of the total federal government budget in 2024. That's out of $6.8 trillion. Now, in terms of discretionary budget, which includes the military, but it excludes things like Medicaid, Social Security, and those kind of things that are long-running programs that nobody's really going to touch much. Out of the discretionary total, that's $1.6 trillion. That's still only a little over 1% of that budget. Well, compare that to some other things. SpaceX revenue, 2025 should be about $15.5 billion. It's already approaching what the NASA budget is. And the way SpaceX has been growing, if that continues, they'll surpass it pretty quickly. Now, half of that revenue is actually because of Starlink, the satellite broadband system. But some other just random commercial kind of comparisons. The amount of money that the Apple AirPod earphones sells, $18 billion. So what we're talking about in the budget here, that NASA will have pretty much the Apple AirPods budget. Carnival Cruise Lines, which includes Carnival and a couple of the other cruise lines, that's about $25 billion. So they're coming back from about that range. Northrop Grumman, a major space and defense contractor, they're at 41.
So on the subject of the comparisons of budget, I wanted to point out that one of my associates from NASA Ames, Lynn Harper, has been working as strategic manager for the ISS National Labs, or strategic advisor for the National Labs on ISS. And she has mentioned in some meetings that I've been on with her that the Merck drug Keytruda has had so much improvement in the microgravity processing that they've been able to do on it that it no longer would need to be administered in a hospital. It can be administered at home. And the estimated value of that is something like $50 billion.
So this is which is manufactured in space?
Being manufactured on the space station. So that's half the cost of the space station right there, one product.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of that. And unfortunately, they're going to cut back a lot on these experiments going forward, cutting back on crew sizes and cutting back on everything going on associated with it. I'll hit a little bit more details on this. But overall budget impacts here, almost all new or even incomplete programs are pretty much canceled. That includes the Mars sample return. There's a couple of probes going to Venus and any of the future space telescopes except for the Nancy Roman one. Nuclear propulsion. I knew Doug was going to cringe at that one. They're definitely canceling out of that. And by the way, so DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Group, the military side of that was a joint project with the military. They already had basically backed out of that. So it was up to NASA to continue the nuclear propulsion study. Anyway, it appears that nuclear propulsion is dead again. It's not the first time. It's been dead multiple times in the past. What they're saying is that, I guess, any testing related to anything nuclear has just gotten much, much tougher than it used to be in terms of just the bureaucratic requirements for it. That, among other things, that just makes it hard to even test. And that, and probably a lot of people are just afraid of nuclear. But anyway, that's killed. But what's actually more disturbing is there's a lot of programs where they're based on spacecraft that are already launched and out there, and they're canceling those. New Horizons, which was launched back in 2006, it's already out there, like the Voyager spacecrafts 1 and 2. It's already out there past Pluto. And it actually has much better instrumentation than Voyager still has left working. they're down to just a couple of scientific instruments. This thing still has 10 to 20 years of life left in it by all estimates in terms of how long they think the parts will last, having enough thruster capability, and so on. OSIRIS APEX. Now, there was the OSIRIS-REx mission, which probably a lot of people remember. That's when we went out, we sampled an asteroid, sent the results back to Earth, the samples, and we got them. So they did that, but they still had a spacecraft out there. So they were sending that on. They were going to go to this asteroid Apophis, which is kind of a pseudo-moon of Earth in a way, and they're dropping that, even though it was already in progress. They were on their way. The Juno mission, this was launched in 2011. It was still actively monitoring Jupiter and its moons, so they'll kill that. The Chandra X-ray Space Telescope, people estimated that still had 10 years of life left in it. They're going to kill that, too. And an odd one is the Mars Maven satellite. It's a communications relay satellite. It's already in place around Mars, and actually they're talking about killing that. The odd thing is that on the next page, they are funding some Mars-related efforts, one of which is to put a satellite around Mars. They already had one. That didn't make a lot of sense. So there's a total of 19 science missions that are actively being canceled, which has a cumulative investment of about $12 billion in it so far. Now, of course, there's always the sunk cost fallacy. Just because you spent the money doesn't mean you should necessarily keep doing it. But most of these programs seem like they were things that ought to be maintained, and they're killing them. Not everything, though. The Nancy Gershwin Space Telescope, that one's been cut, so it'll probably get delayed some, but it's not eliminated. That one is actually nearly complete, almost ready for launch. So that probably would have launched either this year or next. I don't know what the impact will be for this.
It's undergoing shake testing.
Oh, okay. So there's still some testing anyway,
Yeah.
I guess. So the Dragonfly mission, we had a successful helicopter on Mars. Well, what they want to do is they want to send a helicopter and put it on Saturn's moon Titan, which is actually a really interesting one. The atmosphere is really thick there, so it's a whole different atmosphere than Mars had, which has almost no atmosphere, and yet they still managed to make a helicopter work. Oddly enough, that one survived. Also, the Near Earth Orbit NEO Surveyor, that's surveying asteroids that are near Earth. Basically, it's kind of a planetary defense monitoring kind of situation. Actually, the National Space Society had lobbied for that one pretty hard, and somehow or other that one did survive as well. About the only new thing is there's some money in there for Mars exploration. Okay, so National Space Society has positions on this stuff. They put out about 3 different memos, and this is kind of a summary from all of them. First of all, they say they strongly oppose the overall cuts. They actually favor increases in the NASA budget. The words are, the robust investment is essential for American leadership, economic growth, and technological innovation. Now, they do say, on the other hand, that there's a lot of areas that have been neglected by NASA. Not completely neglected, but just not given a lot of budget. Things like closed life support, closing the loop as much as possible, and in situ resource utilization, living off the land. If you're going to go to the moon or Mars, you pretty much want to have a lot of information in place about how do you actually live there for more than a few weeks. You got to basically make use of materials at hand. There have been a lot of small studies, but there's not enough emphasis on it that we could say, okay, we have all this stuff off the shelf and ready to go. We're not there. Space-based solar power for a long time has been supported by National Space Society. Even more basic things like just surveying the resources of the moon, Mars, and asteroids. NASA had already been neglecting that stuff. Like they canceled the Viper mission, which was going to do a lot of prospecting on the moon. But they're killing as much of this as they possibly can. Artificial gravity studies. We don't really know how much gravity you need to live long-term anywhere. Would the moon be enough? Would Mars be enough? Until we actually start trying out, probably in space stations, just rotating them and seeing how much better people can live, whether it's feasible to live on these smaller planets or moons, in planetary defense. They actually agree with some of the cuts. Basically, the transitioning away from the SLS, the rocket, the Orion, the Gateway, all that stuff, basically saying that should just be turned over to commercial development. And one a little more questionable maybe is the Mars sample return. They're agreeing that, it's just so costly. For whatever reason, we haven't seemed to figure out a decent way to do this. Maybe we're just better off waiting for humans to bring those samples back. Maybe that one's a little more questionable, but what they're saying is if something has to be cut, okay, maybe you let that one go. A big part of what the National Space Society has been advocating is we really need to go to the moon and stay. And that was actually a NASA slogan for a little while there, but the plans didn't actually match up. And that included Artemis. So really, Artemis didn't look toward permanent lunar bases. It talked about getting there and setting up some stuff as experiments. and then using in situ resource utilization. Again, small projects, lots of those, but not enough to really have a program. Unlike what the Chinese are doing, is they're just going step by step. They're saying, we're going to set up a base there and do whatever it takes. We've never really had that kind of commitment from NASA, and that's always been an objection that NSS has raised on NASA funding. And they're saying, okay, well, it applies here as well. There's still kind of an emphasis in NASA. They're still talking about going to Mars, but when they say going to Mars, they're still talking about a flags and footprints mission. And you go there, you spend a week, you collect some samples, and you come home, with really no intention to leave much behind on either the moon or Mars. Really, ultimately, you got to go to space to stay there, is what they're saying. And NASA hadn't really been doing that, and this just makes it worse. We're not doing it at all. So what they're saying is planetary science. You don't want to kill what's out there. The stuff is going on, but maybe it isn't the best use of funds to really find out more about Neptune when we don't know much about the moon or Mars yet. So focus planetary science on the moon, Mars, and asteroids. If you're going to focus at all, if you have to cut funds, at least focus it on the things that might actually impact where we're likely to want to go in the next oncoming decades, and support, obviously, human and commercial development. And they are strongly saying we got to fund the ISS more. We want to transition to commercial low Earth orbit destinations, Axiom and VAST. But we want to make sure that there's something in place and we don't just drop it. Otherwise, all you're leaving is the Chinese space station is the only one that's viable. So that's the National Space Society position. So what's next? This is just a proposal. It's a so-called reconciliation bill. Those are passed because, in theory, they don't have too much non-budgetary impact items. If you do that, you can pass it with just 50% majorities in the House and Senate. So that's what they're trying to do. There have been some attempts to fix this, and Ted Cruz proposed adding $10 billion, which actually would have increased the budget. In my mind, he's specifically saying, though, that that's for the worst possible programs. Of all the places to spend money on NASA, we're throwing away more money at SLS, Gateway, Orion, just to do the flags and footprints is probably a waste of money. But that's exactly what he's proposing doing. But the other thing is, NASA is going to be rudderless. What you'd like to have is a NASA that understands what the goals ought to be, which I think include being strategic about expanding into space. But it's going to be rudderless. If you don't have somebody there to stand up and say, well, some of the stuff you're proposing is crazy, NASA's just going to drift and drift. And, it'll just get picked to pieces. So we need a new administrator. The one who was recently nominated, Jared Isaacman, for instance, he was a big proponent of nuclear propulsion. He thought we ought to keep going that because in the long term, sending chemical rockets to Mars is just really too expensive. It takes too long. You're exposed that much more to cosmic radiation and everything else. Like, why not just go for it? Yeah, it's not going to have an impact in the next couple of years, but it will eventually. In the big picture, in the longer term, it's pretty clear you almost have to have that. But we're just kind of ignoring all that. I threw a lot of stuff out there, that some of which may be politically arguable. Unfortunately, NASA can't escape politics as soon as you're spending taxpayer money.
Question or comment, really, too. I'm glad you're bringing up a lot of these issues that we have found. You and I have been out doing the Moon to Mars objective workshop, and I've been very involved with the policy committee. Just one thing I want to make an announcement about is anybody here going to the ISDC in Orlando? Yes. Okay. I'm going to be doing a panel on what we call the Evolvable Lunar Architecture, which was done in 2015. It was released at the National Press Club on July 20, the Apollo landing anniversary. Xavier's going to be the moderator, and I'm leading the panel, basically putting this together. But we're going to talk about a study that was NASA funded that I was one of the co-authors of back in 2015. We released it on the Apollo 11 anniversary, and it proposes that NASA should offer to buy propellant from commercial providers on the moon and offset any savings they get by reducing the number of SLS flights to going to paying for propellant. This study, although NASA didn't do that, it did drive a lot of what's happened with the commercial providers, those 3 landers that were en route to the moon, all at the same time, different providers, landers, different rockets launching. That was all stuff we recommended in that. So there's a lot of stuff that was actually done, but there's some things that weren't. So I'm going to talk about, with our panel, the kinds of things that we did recommend then, what opportunities we have now, and try to get some of those things going.
Maybe afterwards you can tell us how that went.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do have one more question, and that is, you're talking about the cuts to the NASA budget, and there at the very last, you dangled out a little ray of hope, and that was, correct me if I'm wrong, that you said this is a proposed budget for the next year or 2 years, and that therefore none of this has yet been set in stone.
Right.
Although apparently NASA is responding already, and the contractors are responding by cutting positions already, that there is at least a possibility, if I write my congressman, that maybe if I speak up at this point, that at least they will know that at least there's one voter out there who thinks that these science programs need to be retained. Am I correct in understanding that?
I think so.
Okay.
Basically.
All right. Just wanted to double check it. We, the voters, are still in the game, and we still have a voice if we stir ourselves to take some sort of action, letter or email or something.
Yeah. Normally the budget proposals are just completely ignored, but this is a little bit different because it's the continuing resolution kind of thing where, it could actually pass, and then, we have to follow through with it. The Senate has yet to weigh in on this, so that's where there's still hope. Unfortunately, SLS was the Senate launch system,
Right.
So
yes.
You can bet that they'll put back in the pork that they favor. They won't necessarily care about NASA objectives.
I'm thinking about save Draco and save all those satellites that are way, way out in the outer solar system already. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever to kill a satellite that is alive and functioning out in deep space after 99.9% of the money has been spent to get it out there and keep it alive and generating good science, than to just turn around and shut it off.
Yeah.
That just doesn't make any sense at all.
Now, the other hand, also NSS. I mean, NSS has issued position papers. I don't know if they're trying to organize anything more. Maybe you can comment on that.
Same, by the way, with space station. It was designed for indefinite life with maintenance. It could be continued if there was a will to do it.
Okay, that's extremely important to be aware of that.
If Kevin, you could unmute yourself.
Yes, my question is since the ISS was built to be unmanned, the budget between the cost for manning it versus unmanned, does anyone have any data on the running costs when it's not manned? Just the amount of money it takes to keep it human rated. It's engineered that way.
Yeah, I don't know of any studies that have been done as to what could be done, but yeah, you could. I mean, it was designed to be able to be operated without crew on board for some periods of time, not indefinitely for unmanned, uncrewed operation. But I don't know of any studies that have been done to say what all could be automated and what could be done, and what would happen if you didn't have to.
See, that's kind of interesting
if
because
you didn't have to actually keep it all pressurized.
Yeah, because what we'd always heard was it was designed so that you needed both Russian and Americans present to even run the thing at all. And that was a political thing to purposely make it impossible to run without both of us being there.
And it may be that's a design modification that can be done on an improvement.
Well, that's true.
I would raise one other point, and it's the question of what would be the point of having it really unmanned? I can think of a factory with 1,300 people employed, and it's like, oh, well, everyone just goes away. Oh, but the lights, we can still turn the lights on and off remotely. Some of the computers are working on and off remotely, and their fans and pumps working remotely. But what's the point?
Well, one point could be just to keep all that metal up there so we can recover it later.
Some of us here were at Axiom Space for a plant tour, and that was through the American Welding Society. And Axiom is planning on cannibalizing the International Space Station, recycling everything they can on it before it's brought back down, including the water, which I thought was a unique concept. So I'd say the days are numbered for the International Space Station because they're already in contract.
Yeah. Although actually they even cut the budget for the SpaceX vehicle, which will bring it down.
So Doug, to answer your question, one possibility that could be done is it's got 90 kilowatts operating solar power. That could be used for space-to-space power beaming to a unpressurized module nearby. It could be extended out. You could actually potentially use that power to demonstrate electric propulsion to go to a bi-elliptical orbit maneuver to change the plane from 51.6 to something more useful for lunar access or Mars access, assuming the Russians really decided they wanted to leave in 2028 and we said goodbye. And when we got some Axiom modules that could stay attached and continue to use the space station as a resource node and so forth. So there's a lot of potential for it.
Other space-related videos or slide presentations by me are available at the link shown here. That includes a list of videos at my YouTube channel, so you can view them or subscribe for notifications about future videos. These presentations are mostly made as part of the meetings of National Space Society's North Houston chapter, and the link to that is shown. Topics like these are presented as part of a monthly news segment, and there are also lots of other interesting speakers and open discussions. You can attend in person or online via Zoom. Come join us.